Welcome back, everyone, to the next episode of the Search Off the Record podcast. Our plan is to talk a bit about what's happening at Google Search, how things work behind the scenes, and who knows, maybe have some fun along the way. My name is John Mueller. I'm a search advocate on the search relations team here at Google in Switzerland. Today, I'm joined by Gary, also on the team.
Good day.
And Martin.
Hello.
Both are on the search relations team, actually. In this episode, we're back at Steve, working on our theoretical search engine. If you don't know what Steve is, then check out episode 17 of our podcast. Just to be clear, this is not Google. A theoretical search engine makes it a bit easier to talk about what might be done if we started fresh. So, welcome back, fellow Stevians. This time, we're going to discuss guidelines for people who make websites. What kind of guidelines? Well, you'll see. Gary, what should we include?
Well, I definitely think we should have quality guidelines, for example, because quality guidelines are great and we can use them in very imaginative ways.
Can they be a little less vague than saying you should make a good website?
Yes, please.
What would be good quality in terms of making a website? What would you say?
I mean, there are lots of things to that, right? Like write good content, for example.
But what does that mean? Like a certain word length or?
Well, no. So this is my pickle with certain search engines guidelines as well. Like write good content, for example, that's not precise. It's like, what does that mean, as you said? And I think we can definitely say more about it, like structure your content better or use words instead of images to express your thoughts. Write naturally. Like if you are writing as a robot, then probably is not going to do any good for your website. There are things that we can say, but when I'm saying quality guidelines, I'm thinking more about the imaginative ways that people try to spam, perhaps, search engines.
Basically trick a search engine into believing this is useful when it isn't.
Yeah, and then rank the content more or higher, or let's say. And for those practices, we definitely need guidelines because some things can be borderline. Some things are just plain spam. Like, for example, if you think of keyword stuffing, that was very prominent in the earlier days of the internet. Like those are clear-cut spam and they are not useful for users. So why would they be useful for search engines?
Okay, so no keyword stuffing. Fair enough.
So is this more like policies, like what people should be doing in order to appear in Steve, or is it like a recommendation?
I would say it's more like policies. Like Steve should definitely have policies for content or spam quality. Content quality? I don't know what would be the right word for that. Policies about what people can try to rank in the search engine. So, for example, don't try keyword stuffing because we might manually adjust your rank or the website's rank.
What about like white text on white background?
Yeah, hidden text. That's also good. That's also very 90s, I guess.
But isn't that one a little tricky? Because, I mean, white text on white background is very clearly a spammy thing to do because I don't see any value in doing that there's no good reason to do that. But what if you're hiding text behind, I don't know, a carousel or a tab box or something like that? Then it's not visible, but it's not a spammy thing to do.
I guess that's where the nuances come in. Like you are doing this for UX purposes, or you are doing this for the purpose of manipulating search results.
Right.
Or search rankings.
Right.
But then that also means that someone will have to assess the situation. Basically, someone will have to take a look and see what you are doing on your website and why, which is kind of like a gray area, I think.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it might not be that clear what's happening, and then you need more guidance, perhaps.
So is this a bit like telling people what not to do because Steve isn't that good at recognizing a page like a user would recognize it? Like a user, if you see a page with hidden text, they'd be like, oh, there's no text here.
I mean, in this case, I don't think it's a policy. I think now we're talking a lot about best practices and like guidelines in the terms of like, this is what you should do to make sure that Steve understands that this is good for a user, rather than, hey, if you're doing this, you're very clearly in the bad book. You're definitely doing this to manipulate Steve into believing something that isn't actually there or isn't actually good. It is in a way also about the limitations of Steve, probably, but it's also a thing where if you accidentally had white text on white background, that can happen, right? Style sheets are a thing, and if you do it wrong, then text might not show up for users, and then users won't see the text either. So even you might not have intended to manipulate Steve, you ended up manipulating Steve plus hurting your users. So there's a bit of overlap, I guess.
Yeah, I think it comes down to intent. Like, what are you intending to do with that? Because as Martin said, like, it can happen that the style sheet doesn't load. Like, for example, you are hosting your style sheet on CDN and the CDN's TLS certificate expires. And then the browser will just not load that style sheet. And then suddenly you have weird UX on your site and some text got hidden. Like, you didn't intend to mislead anyone with that. It's a technical problem. But I think that's more clear cut. I think the problem is where someone is purposefully placing objects on the real estate of the page such that they are hiding stuff for the purpose of manipulating search results. That's very hard to assess, I think. It's not that search engines cannot recognize that there is hidden text on the page, but more like there's an intent of manipulation.
Okay. So I guess that would also cover things like text that is not actually hidden, like the old school technique of 1 pixel high fonts.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's also hidden text, right?
Well, I mean, theoretically, you can see it, right? It's just very hard.
I mean, 1 pixel high, that's like Morse code.
Oh, that's fair. You're not even going to have shapes. It's like,
okay, 3 pixels. 3 pixels. It's like for mobile phones, they have a small screen. You have to use a small font. I mean, I guess the aspect is also like what you're trying to include in those hidden elements. Like if you're just elaborating on the text that you already have on the page, it's like, that doesn't really change much for the page. But if you're including aspects that are totally tangential to what you have visible on the page, then suddenly that page shows up in search results where it doesn't really make sense to show. And that seems like a problem. Do you think these, I don't know, Steve Master guidelines, or I don't know what we would call them, these guidelines would end up being framed in a way that you could see them like as a law book or like some legal advice, which is like clearly formulated. Don't do this. Don't do this.
I mean, knowing people, they'll take it that way either way, even if it's not intended to be that. So I think phrasing there is very, very tricky to get right in order to manage the expectations from people reading them.
Also, if people think that they are legal advice, that's fine, but we are not, and I repeat, we are not giving legal advice because we are not lawyers.
And another thing that I think goes forgotten sometimes is it's kind of like a playbook for both people making websites, but also for people making Steve, right? Because if we develop something new in Steve, we need to see how that fits with what we tell people is a good practice or is not a good practice. If we are, for example, saying like, oh, we will do something about people who have invisible text, then we need to be very, very careful on what we define as invisible text for us to be caught in that way. And again, then it comes back to intentions and clarifying the intention, which might be hard to do on a technical level, but it's important that we do this work.
So I guess some of these things are very grayscale, which make them really hard to enforce as well. Do you think there are any guidelines or policies that are like completely clear cut and it's like obvious, like you should not do this, otherwise we should not show you?
For quality.
I mean, gibberish. Like we see not that much anymore, but we still see some gibberish pages on the internet. Not so much in search results anymore, but on the internet definitely, where people just come up with lots of random words that they want to rank for, and then they put it on a page and they hope that they are going to rank for it, and then use affiliate links or something to earn money from those pages. And that's pretty clear cut, I think.
But it might just be Swiss German. Oh, okay. Like random words on a page. I mean, that also feels like something that Steve should just be able to recognize. It's like, these words do not make sense together. We should just skip over it.
But then you can also combine it with different things.
Okay.
Like the other thing of these guidelines is that like you might be able to combine, like for example, if we go back to hidden text, which perhaps sometimes you can't make up your mind about whether it's bad or not because you can't decide if it's for UX or for manipulation. But then you combine it with gibberish, and then suddenly you have much better grip on what's happening on the site. Basically, the owner of the site or whoever is producing the content is actually trying to manipulate something. So it's probably good to have. Not so prominent anymore, but it's still probably good to have something about gibberish, for example.
Okay.
Then we have links, for example.
Yeah.
I say for example a lot. Interesting. We have links. And we need guidelines for that as well, because as far as I remember, when Martin was coding up in JavaScript the ranking algorithm for Steve, he was using links as a ranking factor.
Yeah.
Can't we just like move away from links?
But I read this really cool paper. Sure, it's a bit dated, but it kind of has a point on the fact that if good things link to your thing and lots of good things link to your thing, then there might be a correlation in that thing being linked to also being quite good. But obviously we can't just use that one ranking factor. We have to use other things as well. I
mean, like, couldn't we just get rid of links as a ranking factor? We can use them to discover new content, but it feels like at this point, like the links on the web are completely unnatural.
I think there's still a good deal of natural, useful things out there in terms of linking, but I don't think the links are any like really, really important ranking factor. I mean, Gary, you looked at the ranking factor weighting. What do you think? Is links or are links still a very, very important thing, or is it just like one thing out of many?
I mean, it's always just one thing, right?
Yeah, fair enough. But is it like a really important thing or not so much?
As far as I remember, you can rank without links.
What?
So, but since we do have in the ranking algorithm, we do need guidelines for it or policies about what people should do about links. Or can do about links, may do about links. What's the right word? I don't know.
So the guidelines or policies should be about things that we use for ranking and probably also for serving, like how we show things in the search results, as well as best practices for users so that users are happy when they see something. So basically, if you see something in the guidelines, you can assume that either it's used by ranking, it's used in serving, or users might see it. Well, I guess that covers pretty much all of the web.
Well done. That narrowed it down.
Okay. I feel like we're going to need a whole website for all of these guidelines to cover all of these details, like so much stuff. Wow.
Does feel like it. We should definitely publish them so that people can look at them and use them to figure out how to make better decisions on how to make their websites. Yeah.
Just let's not call it webmaster guidelines, because webmaster is such an archaic term.
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Front-end developer guidelines.
No, it's not just developers. It could just be like small business owners or something. Web creators guidelines, website owner guidelines.
But I mean, they're specific to Steve search, right? So it's...
fair enough.
Wait. We talked about policies. We talked about guidelines, best practices. Oh, I like best practices because IETF, the organization that's publishing the standards for the internet, is also using best practices as a word. So we can borrow that. And policies, that's really nice because it has a different meaning than guidelines. Basically, it's like we might take manual action on your site if you are violating these policies, for example. So policies is also good. and they are related to content. So could be content policies. And then we have best practices, we have content policies, and probably we are missing the technical guidelines.
Oh, yeah, technical. Like we should have something like all websites should include 5 lines of JavaScript minimum, right?
To have them banned from Steve.
I mean, for the beginning, I wonder how much of the web we can still represent through our search engine or show to users through our search engine if we don't support JavaScript. Because supporting JavaScript is costly after all, it turns out. Surprise, I know. Gary looks at me like, yes, of course it is. Yeah, I mean, it is an integral part of the web of today, so we need to support it. We can't just ban it.
But I really want to.
Of course you want to, but you can't. Move on.
So what kind of guidelines or technical guidelines should we have? What should we include?
Oh my. So with the technical guidelines, in this specific case, I don't like the word guidelines here, because I think when we come to technical guidance, I believe it definitely is firmly in best practice land. Because for instance, it does make our life a lot easier and it makes it a lot more reliable and reproducible if people are using valid HTML. If their HTML is valid according to the specification and they write HTML the way it was intended, because then we have a very clear-cut semantic and a very clear-cut structure of every document that you put on the web.
So if my website is not valid HTML, it won't be indexed?
That's exactly why I say best practice and not a guideline or a policy. Because, of course, there are billions of websites out there, if not more, that are not written in valid HTML. They have some sort of HTML validation errors. If you would put it into a validator, it would have a problem. We can't just skip over that. So if you are writing an HTML page that is not valid HTML, we still want to index it because the content might be really, really good and useful for users. So we have to deal with that. But obviously, the moment we are dealing with something where the semantics aren't clear, we might make mistakes or we might misunderstand something. We might misunderstand something is a title when it isn't, or is like a headline when it isn't, or is a link when it isn't, depending on what's the problem with the HTML that you wrote. But we have to be lenient and we have to understand it. But you, as the website's creator, might get mixed results. You might not necessarily see the page perform the way you would expect it to perform on the search engine, just because Steve had to make a bunch of guesses. But again, if we were to say, this is what you have to do, you have to write valid HTML, people would get the idea that, yes, if my HTML is not valid, my page won't show up in Steve, which is not true. That's why I would like to call the technical side of things best practices rather than guidelines or even policies.
Okay.
That works for me.
Yay.
What would we put in the guidelines bucket though then?
Okay, so
or we don't need that bucket at all.
I think we need that bucket with technical guidelines. I think one is, as I said, valid HTML does help us better understand the page and have more ease in parsing and understanding what you're trying to put out there. A pet peeve of mine is, because that still is an ongoing problem, use links. Like there's an HTML tag, it's the anchor tag, it has an href attribute that should go to a URL that is resolvable and actually fetchable from the network. If you're doing something fancy like buttons or spans with on-click handlers and lots of JavaScript just to mimic what a link would do, then you're doing it wrong. So that should probably be in there. Use image tags. When you have images, don't use like CSS background images, because we might find them to be just decorative and not like semantically important for the page. Have captions on your figures, have alt text on your images so that people who are using assistive technology understand what's in the image. Also, we save money there if we don't have to do like computer vision, because computer vision, again, is expensive if we want to do that. No?
I think we should still do computer vision on
of course,
on the images, because as you may have noticed, I'm not putting too much trust in things.
Really? I didn't notice.
If there are two sources for the same thing, then that's probably better.
I mean, I understand, of course, we want to do image recognition or image understanding and computer vision for doing that. But if we get input from that, which also is usually fuzzy, right? You don't necessarily, a computer gives you a confidence of some percentage I think to 90% likelihood this is an apple. And when we then also have an alt text that says picture of a red apple, then I think that would reinforce our confidence in believing what it is. So alt attributes should still be there no matter how much computer vision we do. Yeah, I'm saying I agree. So the guideline should still be, there needs to be semantic enriched information like an image tag with alt text that should match the content of the image. Actually, the mismatch between an alt text and what we think is on the picture after doing computer vision is probably a website quality guideline situation or like a spammy issue thing.
I don't know. I kind of like I struggle with the images sometimes because you put images for lots of different reasons on a page. Like you have an image of a beach on a website. It could be, I don't know, a vacation photo. It could be a hotel. It could be a recipe. It could be like water quality measurements or some random scientific thing. And the topic of the website could be completely different, but it's exactly the same image. And we recognize it, it's like, oh, it's a photo of a beach. And it's like, okay, so what do we do with this information that there's a photo of a beach on here? It's like,
I mean, to be honest, that's exactly why I want to call it best practices. So for any image that adds meaningful information, for instance, if it's a website about water quality in Switzerland and there's like a map of different water qualities across Switzerland, that is meaningful to the content, versus if it's a glass of water, like a stock photo of a glass of water, then that you might add for decorative purposes, and then you could leave out the alt text or have an empty alt text. But if we were to say like images have to have alt text, then we are exactly in the area where people would then be like, image of a glass of water, which is not very helpful. But if it's a best practice and we say for images that add to the content, are meaningful to the content, then I think we can say that.
Yeah, this is my pet peeve actually with some other search engines webmaster guidelines, because they're related to images. We actually have something like you must have, or worded as you must have the alt attribute filled out. And then we end up with lots of really weird alt text, like the file name of the image, for example. And then for whom is that useful? No one. And the other thing is that we will have to differentiate between decorative images, functional images, and informative images, as you said, because two of those might not be needed for search engines. Like, we don't necessarily need them in search results, although functional images should still have alt attributes for accessibility reasons. But otherwise, for decorative images, for example, you don't need your alt attribute filled out, because why?
Okay. But it sounds like a lot of these technical things are similarly grayscale and recommendation kind of things. Are there any aspects where you'd say, like, this is very clear cut and obvious? Like, for example, if a page has a no index, should we be like, well, you say no index, but it looks like there's something useful here. We'll just show it anyway.
I think with like no index or also robots tags, we should be quite clear that we follow those. So if you say no index, then the page just doesn't go in the index, which with robots.txt and no index in between is this weird gray area where people are like, I don't want it crawled and I don't want it indexed. But if we can't crawl it, then we don't see the no index. But if we crawl it, then we violate the robots.txt, but we do see the no index. So it's like, it's an interesting one.
It feels like Steve should have a directive for no index and no crawl. What do you think, Gary?
No.
Oh, yeah, we could just call it no.
We are going to do the same thing that the industry does. And we are going to have disallow, allow, and user agent plus the sitemap in robots.txt, and that's all. And then we are going to have the same robots meta tags that other search engines also follow.
But we could be a trendsetter. We could like drive some new standards across the internet.
We don't need new standards.
Hold on. Actually, the draft has us covered because it allows vendor-specific additions.
Yes, that's not to say that it's a good idea.
No, I didn't say that. I'm just saying like we can follow the industry standard recommendation and still do bad things.
Exactly. That's what we are going to avoid. doing bad things.
Okay, fine. But if you want a very clear-cut thing in the technical guidelines, HTTPS, I think, is a no-brainer. I think a website having HTTPS is a good thing.
It's a good thing, but it's also not something that, like, if you are on HTTP, Steve will still try to index you. So it's a best practice, but it's not a guideline.
But it's a very clear-cut best practice. Like, if you can have HTTPS.
But what would be a guideline that is clear-cut?
Oof, a guideline. Well, as I probably said, don't do links with JavaScript only.
Yeah, okay. That's a good one because we are not going to see it.
Or another really good one is don't rely on user input events to extend the content on the page. Like, for instance, lazy loading on scrolling. Because people might resize the window, or they might do something that doesn't trigger a scroll event, or if you do like on click of a button and then it loads more content, then don't expect us to know that.
So what you're saying is that we are going to need JavaScript specific guidelines, not technical guidelines.
Fine.
I mean, we could just simplify it to don't use JavaScript.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Oh, how do we always end up in this place? No.
You led us there, Martin.
No.
Quite literally.
JavaScript is great. Come on. For instance, you use JavaScript to make a PWA, and we do want to index PWAs as well, so that's fine.
Do we though?
I think so.
Do we though?
I think from the technical side, that's all I can come up with right now. Do you have anything else that you would say you would want from the technical side of things?
I mean, don't use plugins, for example, because we probably don't want to support plugins like Flash.
Yeah.
Because
I forgot because I thought they're dead.
Even Adobe isn't supporting Flash anymore, so why would Steve?
But there could be a new plugin kind. Like, I don't know, like Flash 2 or Iron Man or...
I think it's quite unlikely, but yeah, that's a good point. Maybe that might happen at some point, but still, I would say that at this moment we don't want people to use plugins to present content. So for now, plugins should be a no-no.
So is that like our opinion of what users should see on the web, or is it just a reflection of our technical capabilities at the moment? It's like we don't want people to ever use plugins, or we can't process plugins. Therefore, if you want things processed, you shouldn't use plugins.
I mean, we are a reflection of what users might want to see, because users are going to sites through Steve. So basically, whatever guidelines and best practices and policies we come up with, they are, in a sense, reflection of our users' ideas of how content and sites should be.
Okay. So in a kind of like a future world where everyone has their 3D headset on and the internet is a 3D interactive model, then we would try to just index the 3D content like that, like users are seeing it.
That's correct. Also, that one important thing is that the guidelines are not set in stone. They are supposed to evolve. As the web evolves, we will have to keep up with the web. And like going back to your example about plugins, like if there's a new plugin coming out, like Gold Darkness plugin, then we might want to support that because so many people's browsers support it that we also need to support it. And then we will evolve our guideline and change it that, okay, no plugins except whatever I called it, Gold Darkness.
Okay. But I guess, I mean, from a practical point of view, with the way JavaScript has evolved, it would basically just be a JavaScript library nowadays, not a plugin for a browser anymore, right? Or how do you see that, Martin?
I mean, for XR, for instance, there's the WebXR API, so you can create things. If you mix that together with web components, like for instance, Mozilla's A-Frame does, then you basically web components, yeah. Then you end up with HTML that is somewhat semantic, and we might be able to parse that without having to run any plugins. And I think plugins historically had a hard time on the web, and since the invention of the iPhone are basically dead in the water. I don't see anyone coming up with a plugin anymore that can't be done in a JavaScript API or in some sort of web standard.
Cool. Okay. No more plugins. Woohoo. That makes things a little bit easier.
Another thing that I just remembered, if we think about gibberish, what about languages that we don't understand?
Like Swiss German again?
Like Swiss German, yeah. Or like languages that have a completely different alphabet.
I mean, that goes down to indexing. Like if we can tokenize it and we can... Oh, we don't understand content, right? As in Steve doesn't understand content because it's not sentient for now.
Okay. But don't we try to find out what's the main topic of something?
Well, yeah, but for that, you don't necessarily need to understand the language.
Fair enough.
Like if you vectorize the content, then you can create a relationship between the segments and you don't actually need to understand the different words because computers don't understand the words anyway.
Fair enough. It's symbols, basically.
It's symbols, yes. And then the relationship between the symbols. So technically, we can support any language whatsoever except Klingon. I don't want to.
Okay. It would be kind of fun to take some of these science fiction languages and see what our systems can learn from them.
I mean, there are plenty of Elvish pages out there on the internet. And and like Enya, for example, there are hundreds of thousands of pages in Enya. And you can find them. If you search for the words on the page, you can find them. Even like approximations, like you are using a slightly different word for something and you can find them. So our Google synonymization is working properly, even on Elvish. So yeah, I don't see why we couldn't do the same thing.
Fascinating. Cool. So any guidelines, recommendations, best practices you all think are still missing that we should make sure Steve has covered?
I think we should have a brainstorming session at one point and just like put everything on a whiteboard and then shuffle around and put them in the right buckets. This before we actually launch Steve at some point, because at that point we are going to know exactly what kind of ranking algorithms we have and what we need to protect and not. So these probably are the simplest ones and the more obvious ones that we mentioned in this episode, but I'm sure there are many, many, many more.
This sounds like it's going to be a big rule book or best practice book. Luckily, space on the internet is almost free, right?
We will call it the Book of Steve.
Yeah, the Book of Steve, and it's only available in hardcover.
And then if someone on the internet is misbehaving, we are going to throw the Book of Steve after them.
That seems very threatening. I don't know.
I know. That's why I said it.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. Weird flex, but okay.
Cool. Well, I will not give you my address, so because
I know where you live, John.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
Steve
God.
knows everything. Thank you all for joining us here, folks. It was fun talking about our theoretical search engine, Steve. We've been having fun with these podcast episodes, and I hope you, the listener, have been finding them both entertaining and insightful as well. Feel free to drop me a note on Twitter or chat with us at one of the virtual events when we go, if you have any thoughts. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow our guidelines. Thank you and goodbye.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Goodbye.